Hello, I am Mathieu Noir. I'm a PhD student in sociology at Université de Lyon. The title of this presentation is Socialization to the Good Ways of Caring for a Relative Diagnosed with Dementia. This presentation is part of a doctoral research I have undertaken since 2018 under the supervision of Isabelle Malon and supported by a doctoral grant from the Médéric Alzheimer Foundation and France Alzheimer Association. This thesis aims to understand how family caregivers care for a relative diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or a related disease. More precisely, I'm interested in how informal care evolves through the course of the disease, and more broadly, how individuals change with the experience of caring for a relative. In that way, I look at how different actors and support services are likely to shape a caregiver's management of the illness. Accompanying a family member suffering from dementia is not a stable situation. On one hand, the symptoms and therefore the limitations associated to the chronic disease progress through time, and on the other hand, the caregiver's way of managing and adjusting to the disturbed daily life is likely to evolve, as well as their apprehension of their own role. Therefore, the challenge is to understand what triggers these changes in caregiving. This presentation will focus on the use of support services by family caregivers and its effects on the way families adjust to the disease. The reason for this choice is that this is an ongoing fieldwork conducted in support services that I have started several months ago, but also because these services are led by the explicit intention of guiding caregivers through their experience of the disease. For example, by proposing the good ways of behaving or the good ways of understanding and dealing with the relative's new behavior. In fact, since 2000, family caregivers have become more and more visible in the French politic discourse, resulting in a policy that could be translated as care for caregivers or aid to caregivers. This led to a sharp increase of professional services dedicated to assist family caregivers by lowering their burden. In terms of theoretical framework, I came to the notion of socialization because I wanted to understand the differences in caregivers' perception of their relatives, the way they define their own roles as caregivers, and the different attitudes attached to these definitions of what to do and how to do it. This notion of socialization supports the idea that an individual's perception of reality is modeled through interactions with other human beings. Entering the social world of a relative's disease commonly leads to interactions with new interlocutors from the medical and the medico-social sphere. Using support services opens to interactions with psychologists, peers, and volunteers that are prompt to influence families' caregivers' way of dealing with the disease. In terms of methodology, the analyses are based on a qualitative material that combines interviews and ethnographic fieldwork in support services. Since September 2020, I observed the daily activities of two associations managed by France Alzheimer. This includes activities such as caregivers training, support groups, counseling, etc. I should add that in 2016, during my master's thesis, I stayed during 6 months of fieldwork in a respite care service. And I take these observations into account. Also, I conduct waves of open-ended interviews with family caregivers with the intention of a longitudinal follow-up. These family caregivers are mainly spouses and children of the relative diagnosed, but there are also few siblings, essentially sisters. To this day, I have conducted 51 interviews which document 29 family situations. 18 situations were the subject of a second wave of interviews with a follow-up that goes to a maximum of 4 years. These caregivers had already been interviewed between 2016 and 2017 during previous researches, which also focused on the same theme. As I mentioned earlier, once a family carer uses a support service, he or she interacts with new interlocutors whose discourse on the disease and its good care might participate to the construction of the caregiver's role by indicating the good ways of behaving, of thinking, and of taking action. I see it as an institutional socialization to dealing with dementia. Firstly, I think this is important to keep in mind that the use of support service is voluntary. That means that even though I won't talk about it in this presentation, the logic by which individuals use it or stay away from it has to be explored in order to understand the conditions that must be met in order for this socialization to happen. Also, the voluntary use of these services has a second implication. The individual has to be involved in his own socialization. It is not a passive nor a constrained process. One can just stay away or step out of these places whenever he or she wants, which is often the case. The appropriation by caregivers of good practices and good ways of dealing with the disease rely to a large extent on the appreciation of the advice that is proposed, regarding their own views on their situation. Unlike doctors who can hospitalize and constrain more, those involved in helping caregivers, who are more often psychologists, volunteers, have limited power over caregivers' will. They must convince rather than coerce, which has several consequences. For example, this raises the question of the possibilities and ways of guiding family caregivers, an issue which, moreover, becomes problematic when there are discrepancies with the carer's way of dealing with the disease. So this is no surprise that professionals and volunteers from support services often try to establish an atmosphere of trust and tolerance and guide caregivers by selecting and providing information rather than telling what to do and not to do. Now we'll talk about the effect of socializations. The effect of desocializations that occurs by the interactions with professionals and volunteers and peers appear in several registers of care. I will just mention two of them that frequently appears in caregivers' discourses: the self-care and the interpretation of strange behaviors. Self-care and attention to oneself. Some caregivers show attention to their own well-being and express the imperative for a caregiver to seek help from professionals and support services. My observations show that this way of thinking is highly encouraged by professionals and volunteers in order to reduce feelings of guilt and caregivers' reluctance to use professional services, because they would see it as a neglect of their relative. Finally, caregivers are led to recognize that the use of outside help is beneficial because it allows them to reinvest the relationship with their relative in a more affectionate way, and that they are more effective in their own task as caregivers. Now we'll talk about another effect of socialization: understanding strange behaviors. Also, I observed the effect of a socialization to the understanding of how a person diagnosed with dementia thinks and acts according to his specific way of perceiving the world from his new cognitive state. Psychologists and volunteers insist a lot on the importance of this competence, which can be seen as a comprehensive competence. Whether it is during a caregiver's training or support group, they pay a lot of attention about how a caregiver interprets his relative's behavior. And if the caregiver's interpretation don't take into account the specificity of how dementia transforms the way of being and thinking, they will systematically give alternative explanations that are based on an effort to understand how the relative thinks and acts from his new cognitive state. Many interactions are of that kind. This is a process of socialization to the interpretation of strange attitudes. In fact, caregivers' discourse seem to indicate that they internalize some of these conceptions. For example, they will describe some strange behaviors by explaining that their relative experienced past events as if they were happening in the present. This conception of a particular way of thinking, specific to the Alzheimer's brain, reinserts the biographical story of the relative. The past, the vivid memories, the old landmarks are a present reality in the mind of the relative. There are many other instances of this kind. For example, when caregivers would say that their relative don't lie, even though he or she is telling something that is not true. To me, this socialization to the interpretation of strange attitudes and behaviors is a way, among others, to invest the growing discrepancies in perceptions of reality. Sometimes that allows carers to reintroduce the biographical story of their relative, but to a limited extent. In conclusion, I would like to highlight the fact that the use of support services and their effects occur in a dynamic of adjustment to the disease that took place beforehand. In that regard, the effects of socializations I mentioned before should not be expected to occur systematically whenever a person steps into this kind of structures. Firstly, because this person can step out immediately or is just willing to get a specific information without going further, and this is often the case. But also because the calls to invest the good ways of dealing with the disease can be convergent or in opposition to the adjustment initiated before being exposed to these discourses. This invites to an in-depth analysis of the articulation of these two dynamics, with a strong attention to their temporalities. First, the socialization by the experience of a daily life with a relative with dementia, and the socialization by the interactions with different individuals from the medical and the medico-social or associative sphere.